Dare we do a full throttle punch out? I think we do. Here we go. 3, 2, 1. Oh, God. Okay.
This battery. This is the reason why today's quadcopter build is so freaking exciting.
What's so exciting about a battery? Ooh, battery?
Because this battery is not 4S. It's not 6S. It is 8S. Look at that balance plug. Count them. Count the wires. This is an 8S battery. And we went a while back from 4S batteries to 6S batteries, and most people agree that 6S batteries were better. You had longer flights, less voltage sag, better response time. Just most people agree, higher voltage is better. So why did we stop at 6S? And the answer to that is there just weren't very many ESCs out there capable of handling higher voltages. The equipment wasn't there, so we stopped. But today, there are a few ESCs out there that can handle 8S voltage. And just a few months ago, I got to try an 8S Freestyle quad with Rotorite in Orlando. I got to try it for like one pack. It really made me want to try it some more. So today, we're going to build a 5-inch Freestyle quad to use this 8S battery. I'm Joshua Bardwell. You're going to learn something today. Before we get into the build, I gotta say, the sheer amount of power and performance you get from this quadcopter is completely unnecessary, and many of the components are way more expensive. And in my opinion, the higher voltage also means that you are more likely to like blow an ESC or something. So what I'm getting at is that this should not be like your first or second build. And as a result, I'm not going to treat this like a beginner build where I take you through every single step. I'm going to focus on the stuff that's unique to an 8S build and skip over some of the steps. And I know that's pretty unusual for me, so I just wanted to acknowledge it. Let's do it. Let's start the build with a rundown of the parts that I'm going to be using and a description of why I've selected these parts. There are links to these parts down in the video description below if you want to try and follow along with this build. The reason I selected this GNB 1300 milliamp hour battery is that it is one of the only 8S batteries that is made for quadcopters of this size. If this turns out to be popular, I expect we'll see more, but basically the existence of this battery is in some ways what inspired this build. The ESC is the T-Motor F60A Mini, and it is one of the only 8S capable ESCs on the market. And you're not going to be able to do a build like this without an 8S capable ESC. Everything else on the build, the flight controller, the video transmitter, you can and will use a voltage regulator to bring the voltage down because they're all going to be rated for 6S at most. But the ESC has no choice but to handle the direct battery voltage, and so you must have an 8S rated ESC if you're going to proceed on this build. I do have to say thank you to T-Motor. T-Motor is in some ways sponsoring this build because they sent me the flight controller, the ESC, and the motors, which we'll get to in a second. The motors are T-Motor F60 Pros, except why don't they have any markings on them? They're prototype motors, and what makes them suitable for this build is that they are 1500 kV. Now, in case you're new here, kV times the battery voltage equals the RPM at the prop. So generally, you have like a 5-inch prop. There's a particular RPM range that 5-inch prop is going to want to hit to perform correctly. And therefore, as you go to a higher voltage, you'll go to a lower motor kV so that you keep the prop in the desired RPM range. But we're doing something a little screwy here. This is a 1500 kV motor, and we're using an 8S battery. This is a crazy high RPM that this prop is going to make. And you would think it would be bad, but on that one pack that I got when I was in Orlando, it was not bad. It was good. Now, if you're following along with this build, you've got a problem because there aren't very many, if any, 1500 kV motors available in this 2207 size that is appropriate for 5-inch props. So what I'm going to suggest you do is you get something like a 1650 to an 1800 kV motor that's designed for 6S, and then use a Betaflight motor output limit in the PID tuning tab to bring the RPM down to something reasonable. Just an example of how to do that math. If you had an 1850 kV motor, you would take 1500 kV as your desired target out of 1800 kV is your actual motor, and that gives you 83%. You would use a 0.83 or 83% motor output limit to make the 1800 kV motor act like a 1500 kV motor. In my experience, any motor output limit down to about 75% works okay, although we are a little bit of unexplored territory here. I think you're going to get better results if you try to get a lower kV motor in the like 1600 to 1650 kV range in the 2207 to 2208-ish size. Now, normally I would start a build like this by assembling the frame, but you can see that my frame is already been assembled. And the reason for that is that I did a full review of this frame and I assembled the frame as part of the review. So again, the link to that video is down in the video description, but you may or may not choose to use this exact frame. So if you're following along with the build, maybe you wouldn't follow those instructions anyway. Before I install the ESC, I want to point out that this frame has press nuts installed only for the 30mm sized mounting holes. The 20mm size holes are just cut through the carbon, and it's really important that you install a nut here. In fact, Chris Rosser did a video about how important this is for preventing bad vibrations from getting transmitted to the flight controller. He calls it the golden nut. So if you don't have press nuts or some other way of affixing these mounting screws, go ahead and put an M3 nut to hold everything together. The Flyfish Volador has an XT60 mount in the rear, and normally the thing that would annoy me about this is that when you run the wires back through this section of the frame, they get in the way of the VTX. You end up cramming the VTX and the wires in, and it just seems like a waste. But the Volador has done something clever. And I don't mean this channel that's been routed out of the carbon here, although that's probably what the intent of that channel is. That's clever too. But what I think I'm gonna do is I'm gonna run them down through this hole, through this section between the bottom and the mid plate, and then up through this hole here, perhaps, or maybe this hole, I don't know, and right to the XT60. And then they won't take any space on the inside of the frame. For the battery leads, I'm going to be using 14 gauge wire. And if you compare that to the 12 gauge wire on the battery, you might think I'm going to experience some performance loss. It's true that 14 gauge wire will have just a little bit more resistance and just a little bit more voltage loss than 12 gauge. But since I've got to kind of snake this wire through the frame, the additional flexibility of the 14 gauge is going to help. And I did some tests a long time ago where I very precisely measured the effect of 12 versus 14 gauge battery leads. And the bottom line is that when we're talking about a length of just a few inches, it's almost negligible. And it's especially negligible the higher the voltage you're at, because higher voltage with lower amps means less resistance on lower gauge wire. So that's what we're going to do. I worry that if I pass it through this hole, it's going to be in the way of the video transmitter, because that video transmitter is taking up this entire backspace. So we're going to pass it out the back. We're going to look at the top plate to make sure we install it facing the right way. We're going to pass them through here and grab them and pull them up there. And then we got a little slack there to play with, so we don't want there to be any tension on the ESC. So I'm going to just kind of like push these back in just a little, so there's a little bit of slack, and so I have a little extra room to work with if I like screw up. And then I'm going to cut them to length. And now it's the future, because I had to buy this voltage regulator and wait for it to come in the mail. See, the problem is that none of the electronics in this quadcopter, except the ESC, will run off of 8S voltage. They will all fry if you give them higher than 6S voltage. So you have to have a voltage regulator to bring everything down to a safe voltage. This voltage regulator is, I think, the one that you should get. The problem is you have to get a voltage regulator that takes 36, 37 volts input, and those tend to be really big. This is the smallest, lightest voltage regulator I could find that takes 36 volts input, 8S voltage, and has a decent amp rating, 4.5 amps. The other ones that I could find were a little bit smaller and a little bit cheaper, but they were only rated for like 2 amps and change, and I just didn't feel great about that. I always like to have a little bit of headroom on my voltage regulators just in case. So this is, it's like $25 for this voltage regulator, but hey, 8S, nobody ever said 8S was gonna be cheap, baby. On this regulator, the 3 pads we're most concerned with are the VN, ground, and V out pads. You can basically ignore the other pads, or if you really want to know what they do, you can go read the Pololu product page for this regulator. Each of these pads is duplicated, so we've got 2 V ins, 4 grounds, and 2 V outs, and we're only going to use one of them. Next, we're going to take the wire harness that goes from the flight controller to the ESC, and on the ESC side, well, it's reversible. It doesn't matter which side you do it on. But on one side, we're going to remove the power and ground wire from this plug because we don't want the flight controller to get vBat from the ESC. And I can just do that by taking a very fine bladed knife and lifting these little tabs and pulling out the pins of those last 2 wires. They come right out. This is what you would do if you were trying to shuffle the pins around or repin the connector. You would want to be really careful that you didn't damage this connector because you were going to be putting the wires back in. In our case, we're not going to be doing that, but it's probably still a good idea to be careful, and you never know. And then here's how the voltage regulator is going to wire up. We're going to have ground and V out going to the flight controller, black and red. And we're going to have V in, and this is just a bare red wire that we're going to solder to the ESC, and ground, which is a bare black wire that we're going to solder to the ESC. The technique that I like to use for a situation like this where I'm trying to add some small wires on top of my ESC pads is to put a little extra solder on top and use very light pressure, maybe even float the soldering iron slightly above the pad or the joint so that we build up a little ball of solder on top of the joint, and then just drop this down into it without flowing the whole joint so the main battery lead doesn't come free. In case you're wondering, where did you get all these boxes of screws and, you know, with a wire that I use to wire up the regulator? Well, where do I get all that stuff? I've actually got a page on my website, fpvknowitall.com, which has a list of sort of a bunch of hardware and miscellaneous stuff that you might want to have, tape, screws, that kind of thing, in the world of FPV. I'll put a link to that down in the video description. It's the ultimate FPV shopping list is what I like to call it. There's just a couple other things I think we need to figure out. First of all, is the regulator going to fit? Yes, it is. I'm going to need to find some kind of tape or zip tie to secure that, because I don't want it rattling around there, but we're going to be okay. It will not fit flat, but it'll lie sideways. The other thing I need to do is I really feel like we need a capacitor on this build, right? Surely we need a capacitor on an 8S build, and I don't think a capacitor is easily going to fit here in the back, so I think I'm going to solder it to the regulator. I would normally maybe run some wires up to the front and put the capacitor here behind the camera. Capacitor is not as effective if you run wires to it versus just connecting it directly to the ESC, but it will be better than nothing. And we're going to need to use a 50 volt capacitor. For once, we definitely can't use a 35 volt capacitor. I mean, we could probably wouldn't like immediately blow up, but 50 volts is going to be better. Oh my God. Oh my God. Tell me I have a 50 volt capacitor. 25 volt. It's not helpful at all. Alrighty. Well, 35 volts it is. 38's not that much more than 35, right? I'm going to make sure to get the negative leg on ground and positive on V in. And fortunately I have a spare hole, I'll just stick that through. And I'm just going to kind of bend that over like so and lay it up against here. And in addition, I'm just going to take a little bit of double-sided tape to just hold it in place and give it a little padding. So here's our capacitor installed, V in and ground, and we will reheat shrink that. And we will cross our fingers that exceeding that voltage rating doesn't cause too much problems. Should really use a 50 volt rated capacitor if you can, even a smaller one like 470 microfarads, whereas this is 1000 microfarads. That voltage rating is kind of important. Yeah, that'll fit that. Oh, that's not even going to jiggle. That's just damn near perfect. Wow, fantastic. I'll take that. Put a zip tie or something if we really wanted to stop it from moving, but I think that's in there pretty well.
Now we're going to go to the desktop and do some Betaflight setup. And like I said earlier in the video, this is not a beginner video, so we're just going to focus on the parts of the configuration that are specific to an 8S build. And the first thing we got to do is get battery voltage working right. You got to know your battery voltage so you don't kill one of these freaking expensive batteries. And what's the problem? Well, if I plug in this battery right now, what voltage does Betaflight measure? And it's measuring 12 volts. But shouldn't it be measuring battery voltage? The flight controller can only take up to 6S battery voltage. That's why we installed a 12-volt regulator to power it. And that means that the flight controller is going to show 12 volts until the battery is completely dead and then just falls out of the air. But there is a workaround for this, and it's called ESC telemetry. Most ESCs have the ability to report battery voltage and some other things that aren't really relevant to the flight controller via ESC telemetry. And so if we tell the flight controller to get its battery voltage from the ESC instead of measuring it directly, then we'll get the correct voltage because, of course, the ESC is always dealing with vBat directly. And so the first thing we need to do is find a wiring diagram for our flight controller, look at the ESC plug, and look for the telemetry wire. Now, in the case of my T-Motor F722 Mini that I'm using for this build, that is labeled telemetry, UART4RX. Very, very convenient. But that is not always labeled quite so obviously. For example, if we look at my JBF7 flight controller, it is simply labeled R6. And you need to just know that when you're looking at an ESC plug and you see R6, what that's telling you is that that is connected to UART6RX, and that is used for ESC telemetry. That's what you use a UART connection to an ESC for. It's ESC telemetry. But in our case, that is UART4RX telemetry. So we are then going to go to the Betaflight ports tab, and for UART4, we're going to scroll over to sensor input, and we're going to set that to ESC. And then we're going to go to the motors tab, and we're going to enable the ESC sensor option. I don't know why that's a separate option. I mean, if I enable it in the ports tab, you would think obviously I want to use it, but okay, if this is not enabled, this is not going to work. And then finally, we're going to go to the power and battery tab, and our voltage meter source is going to get changed from onboard ADC to ESC sensor. And here we can see, boom, we are correctly reading that this is an 8-cell battery, and 30.65 volts is correctly being read. That's how you do it. And by the way, that's the same way you do it anytime you build a quadcopter that has more than 6S typically voltage, because almost no, I can't think of any flight controllers that take 8S voltage natively. Maybe there are some out there. But if you're doing something like this with 8S, 12S for a Cinelifter or something like that, this is the technique for getting battery voltage to be measured correctly. And bear in mind, not all ESCs actually support telemetry. A few of them don't, so you're definitely going to want to use an ESC and flight controller that support telemetry if you're in this situation. Here we go. Arming in 3, 2, 1. Okay, so far so good. We'll give it the tilt test. Okay, and the hover test. Here we go. Okay, she'll fly. When Bubby built the Moxie on 8S, he said it wouldn't fly on the default PIDs. He had to dial the PIDs way back. This seems okay. You can see my throttle position in the lower right-hand corner of the DVR. I'm at about 20% throttle. It's cruising. Hover is about 20% throttle. Dare we do a full throttle punch out? I think we do. Here we go. 3, 2, 1. Oh God. Okay. What next? It seems fine. Let's try some like sharp turns. Sharp turns. It's flying great. It's like flying perfect. No prop wash. Okay. I mean, we could PID tune this, but okay. I mean, we could like PID tune this and like try and refine it, but it's actually doing fine. I think this is officially the end of the build part and on to the flight testing and answering the question, like, is this actually better? How is it different, etc., etc. That's going to be a topic for another video, and that video will be in a card in the corner of the screen and linked in the video description when it is out. Yeah, I got to charge some more packs. I'm super excited. I'll see you there.